For this video, we are going to be looking at identifying the types of quadrilaterals based off of their characteristics. You must analyze the characteristics given and decide what's the most specific name of the quadrilateral described. We're only studying parallelograms right now, so our options are only parallelogram, rectangle, rhombus, or square. Keep in mind that you are thinking your way through this family chart. You know you have a quadrilateral, you know you at least have a parallelogram. Parallelograms have properties of opposite sides congruent and parallel, opposite angles congruent, diagonals bisect each other, and consecutive angles are supplementary. Remember the methods of proving that you have a parallelogram. If you know any one of these 5 pieces of information, you know you have a parallelogram. Both pairs opposite sides parallel, both pairs opposite sides congruent, both pairs opposite angles congruent, one pair of opposite sides parallel and congruent, and the diagonals bisecting each other. All of those apply to parallelograms. So if you only know those information, then you only have a parallelogram. If you have additional pieces of information past that, like having 4 right angles or having congruent diagonals, then you would know you have a rectangle. Honestly, if you know that you have opposite angles that are congruent and consecutive angles that are supplementary, if you know that you have a parallelogram and you know that one of the angles is a right angle, then you know that you have at least a rectangle, and you could possibly have a square. If you know that you have a parallelogram and you have sides that are next to each other that are congruent, then you would know that you have a rhombus, because opposite sides being congruent, and if you have sides next to each other congruent, then that means that all 4 sides are congruent. Likewise, if you know that you have a parallelogram and the diagonals are perpendicular, you would know it's a rhombus, or if the diagonals are bisecting their respective angles, then it's a rhombus. If you know you have a parallelogram with the diagonals that are congruent, you would know you have a rectangle. If you know that you have a parallelogram and you have both a rectangle trait and a rhombus trait, then you know for sure that you have a square. So let's look at some example questions like you're going to see. You're going to see this picture, and it's a not to scale quadrilateral, which is supposed to mean that you could imagine it being a rhombus, a rectangle, or a square, or just a parallelogram. So it is definitely not to scale. They've also given you some information here. It's called ABCD. AC and BD bisect each other. Well, if AC and BD bisect each other, this means you for sure have a parallelogram. So you know that you are in the parallelogram family. The next thing it says is that the diagonals bisect opposite angles. This means if you had a diagonal drawn in, that it would be bisecting these angles, meaning that all 4 are equal. Well, that's a rhombus thing. If they also tell you that D is a right angle, well, that's a rectangle trait. So if you have a parallelogram that is also a rhombus and a rectangle, then you know you have a square. And the best name for this shape would be square. On this one, we are told that AB, BC, and CD are all congruent. Now that does not mean that AD doesn't match. It just means we know for sure these 3 match. We also know that AB is parallel to DC. Since we have a pair of opposite sides that is both congruent and parallel, we know we for sure have a parallelogram. Having this additional side be congruent means that since it's a parallelogram and we know that opposite sides are congruent, that AD will also match BC. And now we know that all 4 sides are congruent. So we know we have a parallelogram with 4 congruent sides. This means we have a rhombus. And this shape's best name would be rhombus. For our third example, we know that E is the midpoint of AC. So I'm going to draw in AC. They told us that E is the midpoint. They also said D, E, B are collinear. Points D, B, and E. So if E is the midpoint of AC and DEB are collinear, then E is also on the diagonal DB there. And they said that DE and EB are congruent. Well, once we label all of this, what we have is that we have a quadrilateral where the diagonals are bisecting each other. And all quadrilaterals where the diagonals are bisecting each other are parallelograms. So this is a parallelogram trait. And they didn't give us any more information to make us believe that that might be a rhombus or a rectangle. So for this shape, the best name we can go with is parallelogram. So for today's assignment, you're going to be using these skills to identify the best name of the shape. You'll also have some questions where you're going to be dragging and dropping characteristics of the shapes. You might want to keep in mind this quadrilateral family tree as you're looking at the shapes.